This is One Sentence News, a daily podcast featuring 3 news stories with a sentence-long summary and 1 sentence of context apiece. I'm Colin Wright. This is a sponsored message. I've been using Anchor as my podcast host for a while now, and it's been a pleasure to use. Anchor offers benefits that most other hosts do not. It's free to use, but it also has a collection of tools that allow you to create a podcast completely within the Anchor website or smartphone app. They distribute your show to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other distribution channels without any additional effort on your part, and you can make money from your podcast without any minimum audience size. So you can use it as a more traditional podcast host like I do, but it's also got everything you need to start a podcast from scratch. If you're keen to give it a shot, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. It's Monday, September 26th, 2022. Let's talk about the news. From Reuters, Iran protests Western stance on mass protests over woman's death. The Iranian government is using all sorts of diplomatic levers to complain about some other government's responses to the ongoing wave of protests sparked by the death of a 22-year-old woman who died while in custody of the country's so-called morality police. These protests are the country's biggest in decades by far, and have resulted in the death of more than 40 people, mostly at the hands of riot police sent in to quell the unrest, with mixed results. These protests have been held every night for more than a week, and Iran's antagonists around the world have been celebrating their potency and what they suggest about the perhaps less repressive, especially of women, attitudes of the Iranian people, while Iran's allies have joined the Iranian government in condemning the protests and the foreign governments cheering them on. From the New York Times, the Kremlin's mobilization effort includes forcing Ukrainians to fight their own country. Alongside other efforts to shore up their reportedly dwindling numbers of combat-ready troops in Ukraine, Russian officials have been rounding up Ukrainians in occupied areas to fight the Ukrainian soldiers attempting to liberate those areas. Ukrainian officials and other witnesses report that all men ages 18 to 35 in some occupied regions have been forbidden to leave and have been ordered by the Russian soldiers occupying their towns and cities to report for military duty. Many Ukrainian men are attempting to hide or flee as a consequence of this forced conscription. Reports of Russian men of military age fleeing at-home conscription efforts continue several days after Russian President Putin's partial mobilization announcement as well. And from Bloomberg, Manchin appeals to GOP to seize moment on energy permitting bill. West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat who sometimes aligns his votes with Republicans, is scrambling to convince Republican senators that a piece of legislation attached to a government funding bill is in their best interest, but is reportedly having trouble because of Manchin's efforts on the Inflation Reduction Act, and because many Democrats like it too. The Inflation Reduction Act is being seen as a big victory for the Democrats, and it was only passed because Manchin made a deal with the Democratic Senate Majority Leader to vote for it, in exchange for attaching a piece of fossil fuel industry favoring legislation, which also has some favorable bits for new green energy projects, to a must-pass budgetary bill. But Manchin is reportedly having trouble convincing Republicans that this bill is good for their ambitions as well, in part because they feel burned by his recent work on the Inflation Reduction Act. If you're finding some value in One Sentence News, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your podcasts and/or sharing the show with a friend. You can find out more about this show or subscribe to the email version at onesentencenews.com, and you can support this and other related projects like the Let's Know Things and Brain Lenses podcasts at understandery.com.